So now I've updated the test page to use the custom script that will use a polling strategy in order to figure out whether or not there's an internet connection available. And the nice thing about this is that each one of the browsers will operate in a similar fashion. Also, another nice thing about it is that I can simulate an offline state programmatically. So you notice that each of the browsers are reporting that they're online. And then as I go through and click the checkboxes, you'll be able to see that they all behave the same way when I tell the script to simulate an offline state. So you'll notice that now I have a consistent response from each one of the browsers. Now this implementation uses continuous polling. Now that may work well for your application in your environment, or it may not. There is a middle ground as well. You don't have to do continuous polling like I'm doing. You could poll out to your web server to see if it's there right before you try to make a call. But the benefit of doing continuous polling is that now that you have events that you're able to respond to, so that the page knows instantaneously or almost instantaneously of whether or not it's online or offline. So this is the same test page that we were working with before. I've got the same container up in the HTML, same reference to jQuery. I'm even starting with the same stub, except for one difference that you might notice, that over in the arguments list, there's now an argument for polling URL, and I'll show you that in a moment. But what I want to point out is that if we scroll down to the ready function in jQuery, you'll see that the code that I'm using is exactly the same to interface with this different strategy of offline utility. So as we're going through the code, just know that all the concepts are the same. What you're doing is creating a new instance of the offline utility and telling it what functions you want to run when it's either online or offline. Now there's a few different elements of the offline utility that are for debugging purposes only. I'm going to go ahead and include them in here for you, but they'll be wrapped around with comments so that you know that you can take all of that code out when you're ready to put this into production and you don't need to simulate an offline mode. So the first part that I'll add is just a flag to say whether or not this is running in a debug mode. So we'll evaluate against this little variable here a number of different times within the script. Next, I'll take a look at the polling URL argument, and if no value's been passed in, I'll provide a default. So the convention here is to have the script look for a page called o.html, and I picked O because of offline. So if you don't provide a value into this, it will look within the current server for a page on the root of o.html. And in fact, if you take a look over at Server Explorer or Solution Explorer, you can see that I've added this in here. Now, I created a completely blank file. Since there will be continuous polling going against this file, I wanted the payload to be as small as possible. So there's absolutely nothing within this HTML file. The next little script that I'll add in are some variables that help me manage the events that are being fired. Now, since this uses continuous polling, I don't want the events to fire every single time it finds the known page, because the way this is going to work is running in the background are requests made out to pages on the server. If it finds that o.html page and gets a response back from that request, it'll know that it's online. If it doesn't get a response back, then, well, it's working in offline. So since this is continually going, I need to keep track of the current event name, and you'll see how it's used in a moment to make sure I'm only firing the event when there's been a change in the event name that's happening. And this debug checkbox ID, this is just the ID of the checkbox that's rendered out on the page when you're in a debugging context. So next, I'll add in a custom function that will be able to fire an event. Now here, I'd like to acknowledge Paul Kinlan and his article, Working Off the Grid with HTML5 Offline. He outlines this approach of creating the custom event and doing the polling. So if you'd like to read more about his implementation, feel free to check out the address below. Now I've altered Paul's approach a little bit and even simplified it, but I would definitely recommend that you check out his article so you can see his approach as well. So this function will fire custom events within the DOM. As you can see, it creates the new event, initializes it, and then dispatches that event when you're ready for it to be called. And this works really well to create custom events so that we can decide whether or not the browser is online or offline. Now this next function will call that fire event function only if the current event name is changed. So like I said, it'll be continually looking for this o.html file on the web server. So this function just ensures that only the event is raised when something is changed within that pipeline. Now I've added a function for getURL, and this wraps up the URL that it's looking for, again, mostly just for the debugging purposes. So under normal context, it'll just return polling URL, but if I've rendered out that checkbox to the page and it is checked, then it'll look for this HTML file with a GUID name. So there's a really good chance that a file with this name won't exist on just about any web server in the world, so this works as a safe bet for testing. Again, this isn't anything that you would include in the production version of the script. This just makes it really easy to test your application. Next, I'll add in the function that allows us to easily detect whether or not the browser is working online or offline. So again, here's a link to Paul's article, and I've implemented this function here to just use jQuery to make an AJAX call to the URL that we're looking for. Now, if we get a success response back from o.html, it'll run the function fire event if status changes for online custom. Now I'm creating custom event names because I want to make sure I don't overwrite any of the existing event names within the browser in case there's some other script that's using those. And if that request fails, then the fail condition will call the same function for offline custom, and thereby notifying whatever script has registered with this module that it's now working in an offline context. And just like we did with the last implementation, here I'm doing the same thing where I have a function that allows us to automatically reload the page if the application cache has an update. Next, I'll add in a block of script that will render out that checkbox on the page when you're working in a debugging type of scenario. So all this script is doing is creating some DOM objects in memory and appending them to the body with a little bit of style so that you can differentiate it from the rest of the page. Next, I'll add in the event registration just like we had in the last script. So here, if application cache is available, it'll register with update ready. It'll also register online custom and offline custom if those callbacks are being passed into this module. And the final step is to set up the continuous polling. So this script looks to see if there's an online or an offline callback being passed into the module. Then it immediately checks for the online status, and at that point, it will either fire the custom event for online or offline, and then set up the continuous polling. So here I've set interval for every 3 seconds where it will attempt to either find o.html or the debug page. And again, as I showed you in the very beginning, the use is exactly the same. So use of this JavaScript module will give Code@Homes the ability to respond to some events of whether or not it's working online or offline. So now I've created a new file for offlineutility.js in the app folder under scripts. So we just need to add it into the bundle config. Now that offline utility is available, we can update the home page in order to be able to respond to the online or offline events.